Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be over here with all of you today. And Tim asked me to address this topic of why do animals do what they do, and talk about the influences of animal experience on grazing choices. And so that's what I'm going to try to do, but I'm actually going to broaden out from what Tim asked me to do and try to link back with what was talked about yesterday and forward with what I think will be talked about as we go through the day today and tomorrow. As was mentioned, for the last 35 years we've been interested in why animals do what they do. Animal behavior emerges from a combination of history, the history of the animal, across and within generations, necessity, basic needs for foods and a place to live, as Larry was talking about, and chance, which influences both history and how needs are met. Today what I want to talk about is how change, that is to say movement, influences animal behavior, and relate that to the ongoing debate surrounding continuous versus rotational grazing management. And I'd like to begin by reflecting on the only constant. The only constant in life is change. The world is constantly changing, yet we typically regard change as anomalous, a transitory disruption in a normally constant world. Even Albert Einstein was reluctant to accept change. When he introduced the cosmological constant into the general theory of relativity, what that amounted to was a refusal to accept change as the very essence of the universe. And it was, as he later recounted, the greatest blunder of his career. On a more local scale, when a great volcano like Mount St. Helens erupts, knocking down trees, covering the earth with a layer of volcanic ash for miles around, we think how strange it is that nature should misbehave so. It is, we tell ourselves, a momentary lapse, a kind of geological tantrum. Soon our old planet will regain its composure, its sameness. But the truth is, it's only our short tenure on Earth that deludes us. Our time here is too short to see continents crash together and tear apart. Mountains rise and fall, vast deserts replace oceans. Too short to see literally tens of thousands of plant and animal species coming and going like the ever-changing colors and shapes of a kaleidoscope. Change then isn't the exception to the rule, it's the only rule. Any individual, any social group, any species, if it is to survive, must be able to cope with change. And change causes movement on landscapes, and that's important, and that's what I'd like to begin discussing. So what is the significance of change and movement? How are change and uniqueness related? How do movement and uniqueness interact to influence behavior? In what follows, I'm going to address these questions with reference to the behavior of soil, plants, herbivores, and people. And to begin, we can ask a question: what must management do? What must grazing management do? Well, at its simplest, grazing management must optimize leaf area for plant production following grazing, and it has to provide forage for animal production, as Larry's been talking. And movement, I would maintain, is critical not only for the nutrition and well-being of herbivores, but for the health and well-being of soil, plants, and people. And the first point I'd like to make is that herbivores benefit from movement. Herbivores are built to move, be that due to daily, weekly, or seasonal changes in forage availability and quality, as well as to external factors such as predators. All these things cause animals to move. Even in the absence of movement, though, and this is the key point I want to make, even in the absence of changes in the external environment, movement is so important that animals have built-in mechanisms inside them that cause them to move, causes them to eat a variety of foods and to forage in a variety of places. We've referred to this as the Satiety Hypothesis, and it simply, as regards foods and landscapes, attributes changes in palatability of foods to transient aversions due to flavors, nutrients, and these secondary compounds interacting within the animal. Animals get sick and tired of eating the same old food and being in the same old place is the basic point here. When we look at the central nervous system, we know that neurons for taste, smell, and sight stop responding to the taste, odor, and sight of a food that's been eaten to satiety, yet they continue to respond to other foods. Aversions become pronounced when foods contain too high levels of toxins or nutrients or nutrient imbalances. Aversions also result when foods are deficient in nutrients or when the amount of nutrients required for detoxification are inadequate. Aversions occur even when a food is nutritionally adequate because satiety and surfeit are on a continuum. Cyclic patterns of intake of different foods, thus, are due to eating any food too often or in too large an amount, and the less adequate the food is relative to an animal's needs, the greater and more persistent the aversion. My wife makes me eat oatmeal every day nowadays, and I can hardly stand the stuff, huh? That's the point of the deal here. So, satiety thus encourages animals to eat a variety of food. Thank God they make oatmeal in different flavors and to forage in different places, huh? And that's why offering animals, as Larry said, a variety of foods to eat and places to forage stimulates appetite, thus enhancing nutrition, production, and health. And we've demonstrated this time and again research-wise in confinement, on pastures, and on rangelands. Offering animals choices under these conditions also enables each individual to mix foods in ways that meet its particular needs for nutrients and to regulate its intake of secondary compounds. Variety thus enables individuality and greatly increases the likelihood of providing cells, which is what we're ultimately feeding, with the vast array of primary and secondary compounds essential for their nutrition and health. Conversely, monocultures of plants high in secondary compounds impoverish landscapes to the detriment of soil, plants, herbivores, and people. The second point that I'd like to make is simply that plants also benefit when herbivores move. Several unifying principles of vegetation response to grazing have emerged from scientific studies during the past century, and they were discussed yesterday. These principles constitute widely applied rules of thumb for managing based on well-substantiated physiological and ecological evidence. These principles include two of the following. 1, chronic intensive grazing is detrimental to plant growth and survival. When the frequency and intensity of grazing do not leave sufficient residual plant biomass, and that's critical, both above and below ground plant productivity are hampered, as is water infiltration into the ground, hence the statement we create our own droughts, as is the nutrition and production of animals, as Larry was talking. Second point, plant production and species composition of plant communities can be modified in response to frequency, intensity, and timing of grazing. There are many good examples of this, of these two principles, but I'd like to simply use one that I'm most familiar with to illustrate this. And that has to do with work that was conducted in Sagebrush Steppe over a 50-year period in the foothills east of Logan. That work was begun by Art Smith in the 1940s, where he was documenting what happens with cattle use of these landscapes. It was continued by Phil Ernest and updated in the 90s, 50 years later. And then it was put on a landscape basis by John and Jocelyn Haskell during this decade. They showed this could be done at the level of the landscape. Sagebrush Steppe, what Art Smith and Phil Ernest showed was this. Sagebrush Steppe grazed by cattle only in spring creates great stands of shrubs such as sagebrush and bitterbrush, but little in the way of forbs and grasses. Conversely, Sagebrush Steppe browsed by mule deer only in winter creates great stands of grasses and forbs with little shrub. On the other hand, Sagebrush Steppe grazed by both cattle and deer is a mix of shrubs, forbs, and grasses. It's interesting to note that blue bunch wheatgrass can't tolerate continuous grazing in the spring, but it survives very well when it's grazed briefly early in the growing season and unpredictably across years. That's what doesn't happen when cattle graze continuously in the spring, hence an increase in the abundance of shrubs. However, that's what very likely did happen historically as native ungulates followed the green from the valley bottoms to the high mountains. Without a doubt, there was a strong element of randomness in the timing of these movements, due not only to changes in the biophysical environments, but to changes in the animals themselves, going back to this satiety hypothesis. And this brings me to the most general point that I want to make with regard to the movement in plants. While most creatures are mostly creatures of habit, nature behaves randomly. It boils down to the point Mama made in the movie Forrest Gump. She said over and over again, life's a box of chocolates, Forrest, you never know what you're going to get, huh? One of the most profound insights from quantum mechanics, from quantum theory, is that chance is built into the very fabric of this universe. Quantum theory demolished the classical concepts of solid objects and strictly deterministic laws of nature. At the subatomic level, the solid material objects of classical physics dissolve into wave-like patterns of probabilities. And these patterns ultimately do not represent probabilities of things, but rather probabilities of interconnections. We are coming to deeply appreciate the role of chance in life, not just in quantum mechanics. From local markets to stock markets, tomorrow's weather and hurricanes to global climate change. And biologists are increasingly aware of how chance influences the development, function, and behavior of organisms, a point I'm going to come back to later in my presentation. To conclude then, historically, the movement of animals in concert with the chaotic nature of ever-changing biophysical environments undoubtedly assured grazing varied in intensity, frequency, and in timing within and among years. With regard to plants, the more one varies the frequency, intensity, and timing of grazing within and among years, the greater the likelihood of producing diverse plant assemblages, assuming that's what one wants. The third point that I'd like to make is simply that soils benefit too when herbivores move and plants can grow. Nearly 50 years ago, in a book titled Soils, Grass, and Cancer, French researcher André Voisin noted the connections between soil chemical properties, animal and agronomic practices, and the growth of cancer, and he warned that people in our attempts to produce food for a burgeoning world population have forgotten that our bodies ultimately come from the soil. Our health and well-being is inextricably linked to soil. Advocates of management-intensive and short-duration grazing now emphasize the links between animal impact, healthy soil, and resilient ecosystems. The removal of large amounts of plant cover and the ensuing lack of residual biomass by grazing that's too frequent or intense reduces the potential to dissipate the energy of raindrop impact and overland flow. The erosive energy of water and the long-term reduction of organic matter additions to the soil detrimentally affect numerous soil properties, including increased bulk density, disruption of biotic cross, reduced aggregate stability, and organic matter content, all of which reduces infiltration and increases sediment yield and runoff. Hence, again, we create our own droughts. Animal trampling is a controversial source of mechanical energy that breaks soil aggregates and has been negatively correlated with maintaining soil structure necessary for high infiltration rates. However, soil properties and hydrological processes recover with freeze-thaw action in temperate environments and with grazing deferment following intensive grazing in other kinds of environments. Brief bouts of rotational grazing likely maintain higher infiltration rates than continuous grazing at high stocking rates by maintaining plant residual biomass. There's nothing more important than plant residual biomass in all of this. And regrowth potential. Properly managed grazing thus can enhance soil, plants, herbivores, and people by enhancing herbaceous species abundance and composition. The fourth and last point that I want to make regarding movement is simply that people benefit from understanding and facilitating herbivore movements. I'm currently helping to edit a book on herding practices in France with a researcher by the name of Michel Miret. The book is co-authored by researchers, herders, and researchers who became herders, and it's a fascinating account of integrating people with animal husbandry, landscape ecology, and ever-changing social and cultural norms. Two of the chapters in the book describe herding schools, mostly attended nowadays by young people from cities. They're an amazing accomplishment, a way for young people to learn experientially the facets of the trade, including working with experienced herders. Imagine this for a final exam, Larry. You're given complete responsibility for a herd of sheep, goats, or cattle, whichever you choose, up in the high Alps. You must live with them day and night up there high in the mountains. You must protect them from wolves and many humans who now use these areas for recreation. You must ensure their safety and nutritional needs are met while not harming the vegetation, as you're dependent on the soil and plants for your livelihood. At the end of the season, your grade's going to depend importantly on the condition of the ewes, the number of lambs, and the weight of the lambs. That's what they do. Well, here's the most interesting part to me. When researchers in France began to study the nutrition and production of herded livestock, they were astonished, absolutely astonished, to see the different levels achieved by naive versus experienced herders on these landscapes. Why did they differ so? And how could experienced herders obtain such high levels of animal performance on incredibly rugged landscapes that appeared to lack adequate forage quality and quantity for production of meat and milk? Over the years, what these researchers came to understand is that the herders were using empirical understanding of landscape diversity and complementarities among forages to stimulate appetite and food intake, thus more fully utilizing the range of available plants. They did this by herding animals in grazing circuits. The circuit includes various phases to a meal, all designed to stimulate the flock's appetite and to enhance the use of a broader array of forages in the area. To do so, meals within a day include various phases. I'll give you some examples here. Moderation phase provides sheep access to plants that are abundant but not highly preferred to calm a hungry flock. The next phase is a main course for the bulk of the meal with plants of moderate abundance and preference. Then comes a booster phase of highly preferred plants for added diversity. And finally, a dessert phase of palatable plants that complement previously eaten forages. Daily grazing circuits are thus designed to stimulate and satisfy an animal's appetite, and they do so by allowing individual animals to pick and choose from a variety of plants that vary in primary and secondary compounds. While the idea of variety of foods increasing forage motivation may seem very strange to us here in the West, it's the essence of how herders in France stimulate a flock's appetite throughout a grazing circuit. And it takes a tremendous amount of knowledge to do that. Can you even imagine the amount of hands-on experiential knowledge these herders have not only of animal husbandry, but also of landscape ecology? Talk about applied ecology at its finest. From soils to plants, animals, and humans, they're living it. Several years ago, I gave a 3-hour presentation for Bud and Eunice Williams, and I was talking about these sort of things, and he came up to me immediately after the presentation. It was to a large group, and they were there. And he said, "How many people do you think in this country would have a clue how to do the skills and a clue to do what you're talking about?" And of course, he answered his own question, and I'll let you leave it to your imagination what he thought. But anyway, it's amazing, and I think it would be, that level of skill is just incredible. Well, now I think about what do we know from a science standpoint. It's a hugely interesting field to me, and we're just beginning to understand and appreciate the complexities involved in diet complementarities. Foods are complementary when the benefit of eating foods together exceeds the benefit of eating a food alone. For instance, mule deer can eat more when offered both sagebrush and juniper, foods that contain complementary secondary compounds, than when they're offered only sagebrush. In the case of sagebrush versus that combination, they eat 4 times more with the combination than with just sagebrush, or juniper, in which case they eat twice as much. It's been shown for a wide variety of species this is the case. Brush-tailed possums in Australia can select more of diets that contain both phenolics and terpenes as opposed to diets that contain only one of these compounds. Likewise, we've shown in many secondary compounds, when sheep can choose between foods that contain a variety of different secondary compounds, they eat more than when they're offered foods with only one of those. But it's not only providing choices that matters. Experience is also playing a fundamental role, especially when it comes to these plants like sagebrush and others that have very high amounts of secondary compounds that can tend to deter grazing. We've done a lot of work on this. And I'll give you one example. When we've worked with lambs in this case here, with 3 months of experience mixing foods that contained high in tannins, high in terpenes, high in oxalates, and we compared their preferences to naive animals, much as Derek was talking about experienced versus naive cattle yesterday. Well, during the tests later in life, what we do is we offer, in this case I'm going to talk about now, we offer all of the lambs a choice of 5 foods. 2 of them are familiar to all of the lambs. The other 3, the ones that are high in either tannins, terpenes, and oxalate, are familiar with one group's familiar with them, the other group isn't. Then during these trials, and I know this is getting complicated, but what we do is split these into 2 further groups. Half of the animals have ad lib access to the familiar foods, the other have restricted access. So what happens? Throughout the study then, naive lambs ate much less of the foods with secondary compounds if they had ad lib access as opposed to restricted access to these nutritious alternatives. They basically ignore the foods that are high in the secondary compounds. They prefer the ones that they're familiar with. Experienced lambs, on the other hand, eat a huge amount of the foods that contain the secondary compounds as well as the other 2 foods. They've learned to mix their diet with this broader array of foods. Then these differences persisted for at least 1 year. That's how long we ran the study. In a companion study, and this gets really interesting to me, in a companion study, when access to familiar foods then was restricted to 10%, 30%, 50%, or 70% of ad libitum, it really becomes revealing as to how we behave and how other animals behave. Animals ate more of the foods with secondary compounds, and they gained more weight along a continuum as follows. You had to force them. So the ones that were restricted to 10 and 30% of ad lib, they're the ones that learn to mix their diet. They're forced to do it. On the other hand, if they have 50% or even 70% of ad lib intake, which is still restricted, they'll stick with the familiar foods. It doesn't push them enough to cause them to learn to mix their diet more broadly. Thus, past experiences and prevailing contingencies encourage animals to learn to mix diets that contain secondary compounds. And that, to me, has really important implications for grazing management, including rotational grazing. I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but I want to continue along this theme. While complementarities among forages are an important but little understood area of plant-herbivore interactions, even less is known about what the French herders do, about these foraging sequences and how they affect food intake and performance. But they appear to be really important. For instance, sheep eat much more of food with terpenes when they first eat food with tannins. These findings are consistent with landscape-level studies conducted at the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station that show that ewes with a high preference for sagebrush, a plant high in terpenes, also consume markedly more bitterbrush, which is a plant high in tannins. So you've got the complementarities and likely the sequence there. The tannin sets up the intake of the terpene, basically. In terms of shrubs, the bitterbrush is setting up intake of the sagebrush. We're doing a lot of work nowadays, and I'm going to just give you a couple of ideas here on that. Looking at sequences. The work we're doing with cattle suggests the same sort of patterns. In this case here, we're working with endophyte infected tall fescue and plants that might complement that. Endophyte infected tall fescue is very high in alkaloids. And when cattle first are allowed to graze endophyte infected fescue for 30 minutes, followed by the next food in the sequence being a plant like bird's foot trefoil, which is high in tannins, or a plant like alfalfa, which is high in saponins, or combinations of those. What they do is simply to stop eating the fescue. They'll sit there for their 30 minutes, then they go into the pastures and they eat the trefoil or the alfalfa or whatever's the alternative. But if you switch that sequence such that now the cattle start out with a 30-minute meal of trefoil or a 30-minute meal of alfalfa, now they forage very actively on the trefoil or the alfalfa, but most importantly, when they go into the fescue now, they eat like crazy for 60 minutes. And the same sort of patterns occur with high alkaloid reed canary grass. The key point here is that sequence of ingestion thus greatly influences intake of these alkaloid-containing grasses by cattle, and we're currently exploring the degree to which their behavior is mediated physiologically by interactions among tannins, saponins, and alkaloids, or psychologically, behaviorally, just wait 30 minutes to get to the legumes, or both. Last point I want to make here is that secondary compounds are in fact key in playing roles in these things, and we're showing that. For instance, lambs offered choices among varieties of alfalfa, which are high in saponins, bird's foot trefoil, which is high in tannins, and endophyte infected tall fescue, which I mentioned is high in alkaloids, show a strong preference for alfalfa when you just turn them out and let them feed. But you can change that. When they subsequently receive intraruminal infusions of saponins, tannins, or alkaloids prior to going into graze in these different periods, lambs infused with saponins decrease preference for alfalfa, which is high in saponins, but interestingly, they markedly increase their preference for trefoil, which is high in tannins, and for the tall fescue, which is high in alkaloids. Lambs infused with tannins increase their preference for tall fescue, whereas lambs infused with alkaloids decrease their preference for tall fescue. So when sheep eat foods high in tannins or saponins, along with foods high in alkaloids, the tannins and saponins evidently bind with the alkaloids, reducing their aversive effects. That's the bottom line on intake. In all cases, though, regardless of preference, an infusion of plant secondary compounds induces a more even utilization of the forages, thus enhancing diet breadth. Ruminants thus discriminate the post-ingestive effects of forages with these different secondary compounds. And they're likely not only to increase forage intake, but nutrition, production, and health of animals as well. I'm not going to talk at all about this, but I just want to say that one of the most fascinating projects I'm involved with now is looking at linking the health of soils with plant diversity and expression of secondary compounds with herbivore, not only performance, but also health, and then how all that integrates up to quality of meat and milk for human consumption. These linkages are all happening. Well, all of this matters greatly not only for herders in France, but for grazing management, which has traditionally been based on the assumption that moderate grazing at low stock densities will maintain decreaser species in a plant assemblage. These notions, summarized from the literature by Jerry Holacek and others, maintain, quote, the key species and key areas serve as indicators of management effectiveness. Generally, when the key species and key areas are considered properly used, the entire pasture is considered correctly used. In most cases, 1 to 3 plant species are used as the key species, as you all know. These plants should be abundant, productive, and palatable. Key species are usually decreaser plants that are an important part of the climax vegetation. Under the key species approach, secondary forage species will receive light use, key species will receive moderate use, and ice cream plants may be used excessively. End quote. Question I want to put in your minds is the following. By focusing attention on decreasers, do we not ever so slowly facilitate animals eating the best and leaving the rest? Even our best attempts to favor decreasers may inadvertently provide competitive advantages to increaser species that will eventually come to dominate if they're not used by herbivores over many, many years. Conversely, management that makes use of all plant species, I would suggest, can best maintain biodiversity. Shouldn't we thus focus grazing management on increaser species to maintain the abundance of decreaser species? That's one of those Larry kind of but think about it. Even less obvious, though, now here's where I'm going to go with what Tim's asking from a behavior standpoint. Even less obvious than ecological shifts in response to grazing strategies is the influence grazing practices may have on learned behaviors of herbivores during their lifetime and across generations. By encouraging use of decreaser species, we may very likely inadvertently train generations of animals to eat the best and leave the rest, rather than to learn to mix the best with the rest, thereby creating herbivore cultures that behave in ways counter to what we desire. This leads to the hypothesis that different systems of grazing management cause animals to learn to forage in different ways. Assuming appropriate stocking rates, low stock densities for extended periods, I would contend, are likely could encourage selective foraging and regrazing of individual plants, whereas high stock densities for short periods are likely to encourage diet mixing. If so, what was traditionally considered proper grazing management, continuous or various kinds of rotational grazing at low stock densities, may have trained generations of livestock to use foods and habitats selectively, eat the best and leave the rest, thus inadvertently accelerating a decline in plant diversity and an increase in the abundance of less desirable plant species. Conversely, high stock densities for short periods may train animals to use a broader array of foods, to mix the best with the rest. This notion is based upon three assumptions. First, animals have access to foods that are biochemically complementary and thus can mix their diets in ways that facilitate eating plants that contain secondary compounds. Second, forcing animals to eat all of the foods involves training them through increasing stock density to eat a broader array of foods. Animals will eat more of foods that contain secondary compounds, as I've been talking, and even gain more weight if they also learn to eat a variety of foods that are biochemically complementary, to minimize the impact of secondary compounds and increase the intake of nutrients. Animals who have learned to eat such an array of foods may continue to do so even if they no longer graze at high stock densities, and there's evidence that this is the case. This view then is incompatible with the idea of a linear relationship between stocking rate and animal performance, given that changes in performance may occur if animals learn to eat complementary mixtures of foods. Finally, more even utilization of plants for short periods enhances the ability of plants to regrow, thereby minimizing competitive advantages that occur for most plants not grazed. The crucial question is, do high stock densities cause animals to learn different patterns of foraging behavior? There's certainly evidence of that from a research standpoint in the work that we've done. But there's also evidence to support this from landscape level work. For example, Ray Bannister, who manages 7,200 acres of land in eastern Montana, has modified his grazing management from reliance on rotational grazing to boom-bust grazing, which involves intense periods of grazing during the growing season followed by 2 growing seasons of rest. Such intense grazing ensures that less palatable and weedy species do not acquire a competitive advantage over the other more palatable species. He's trained them to mix the best with the rest. The ranch has some of the highest vegetation cover and diversity in eastern Montana, as documented by people like Joe Fidel, who work for the Natural Resource Conservation Service. To achieve these responses, and this is the key point here, Ray didn't change stocking rates. He was stocked appropriately, nor did the tremendous variation in annual weather change either. Rather, the change from rotational to boom-bust grazing meant cattle could no longer select only the most preferred plant species. Based on cow and calf performance, and this is critical, it took 3 years. You're not going to pick it up in 1 year, 2 years. It took 3 years for raised cattle to adapt to the new grazing management. I'm going to come back to why this is probably happening here in just a minute. But it took 3 years for them to adapt. Weaning weights of calves dropped from over 500 pounds to 350 pounds during that first year especially, before rebounding to over 500 pounds once they'd gone through that adaptation trough. During this time, cows learned to eat shrubs such as snowberry and sagebrush. They learned to eat a lot of the weeds that were on those places. Plants that are usually considered unpalatable due to their levels of secondary compounds. And they learned to eat palatable and unpalatable species. Unlikely they learned to eat those simultaneously to mitigate the effects of secondary compounds. If that's the case, such learned patterns of behavior are likely to be transmitted from mothers to their offspring. And I want to talk about this whole mother-offspring in utero early life experiences here in just a second. But what that does is it creates cultures that could enhance the biodiversity of landscapes and benefit soil, plants, and animals. A culture develops in animals when practices that originate within the group contribute to the group's success in solving a problem. Cultures evolve as individuals and groups discover new ways of behaving, as with finding new foods or habitats or better ways to select or mix a diet out there on a landscape. In herbivores, social organization leads to culture, which is the collective knowledge and habits acquired and passed from generation to generation about how to survive in a particular environment. And all this becomes epigenetically expressed, as I'll discuss here in a minute. It's the process then whereby young animals learn through their parents from their ancestors, and in which new behaviors learned by any member of the group, young and old alike, are passed from generation to generation. Finally, it's a process through which herbivore cultures unique to landscapes can influence in different ways the structure and functioning of particular ecosystems. What it means to be locally adapted to a landscape. Unfortunately, social organization and culture are rarely considered important in the structuring and functioning of ecosystems. And indeed, we manage wild and domestic animals in ways that thwart the development of cultures, perhaps to our long-term detriment. If instead we were to allow cultures to evolve, we may lessen our need for technological fixes and come to rely more on low-cost behavioral solutions to the challenges we face in managing ecosystems. In the process, both our science and management would come to appreciate the processes whereby cultures and landscapes are united. Such knowledge is likely to be invaluable for those who aspire to manage wild and domestic animals in ways that maintain the integrity of animals and of the landscapes themselves. With domestic animals, we've come to rely on fences and grazing systems rather than culture to influence diet and habitat selection. Interestingly, social organization in herbivores may lead to rotational grazing without fences. This notion is based upon 4 assumptions that are fairly well documented, actually. First, social herbivores live in extended families. That's certainly the case. And if you allow sheep, goats, and cattle to go feral, you'll end up with matrilineal extended families. 2, maintaining the cohesiveness of families and their home ranges influences behavior. 3, individuals within families differ in their preferences for foods and habitats. And 4, families maintain their unique identities by avoiding prolonged contact with other families. If these assumptions are correct, then social interactions within families are likely to encourage animals to eat a broader array of plants and to forage in a greater variety of locations as individuals maintain the cohesiveness of the group and respond to different preferences and needs of individuals within their group. Interactions among families are likely to further increase movement across landscapes as different families avoid prolonged contact one with another. Hence, diet and habitat breadth both may increase through social organization, which may be critical for maintaining the integrity of social species and probably was very important in maintaining the integrity of landscapes historically. So, upshot then, as relates to movement. Going back to the article that was discussed yesterday by Dave Brisky et al., they conclude from a review of continuous and rotational grazing, quote, these experimental results conclusively demonstrate that rotational grazing is not superior to continuous grazing across numerous rangeland ecosystems, and they are consistent with those of previous reviews. These results further corroborate the long-standing conclusion that stocking rate and weather variation account for the majority of variability associated with plant and animal production on rangelands, end quote. Well, I agree with their conclusions based on how the studies they reviewed were conducted. I believe the critical question has never been asked. The thread common to everything I've discussed up to this point with regard to soil, plants, herbivores, and people has nothing to do with grazing systems, be they continuous, rotational, or short duration, nor does it have to do with stocking rate or weather variation. Rather, it has to do with movement. Movement of animals is what creates benefits for soil, plants, herbivores, and people, I would maintain. A common assumption underlying all the studies of grazing systems is that they differ with regard to movement along a continuum, from continuous to rotational to short duration. But whoever measures animal movements within grazing systems at the level I'm talking about right today, if animals move in continuous grazing systems, then soil, plants, herbivores, and people are likely to experience the benefits. Conversely, if they don't move, soil, plants, herbivores, and people are likely to experience the adverse effects of trampling on soil, overgrazing on plants, lack of performance on animals, and economic and social woes on people. We've had to work hard, actually, to reduce movement of animals across landscapes, but by and large, we've done it by reducing the incidence of fire, which causes animals to move, to eat regrowth on newly burned areas, by removing predators, which cause herbivores to move, by erecting fences, which serve as babysitters that restrict satiety-induced natural kinds of movements, to name just a few of the practices. What I'd like to do for the remainder of the talk now is to first talk about the value of uniqueness, move from movement to uniqueness, and then tie those two together to conclude. And I'd like to begin by talking about statistics. And with the advent of statistics in the 20th century, great emphasis has been placed on assessing the, quote, average responses to treatments. While the discipline of statistics has advanced our ability to conduct experiments, it has also made variation among individuals a foe to counter rather than a friend to embrace. Today we emphasize means and populations rather than individuals and variation, while nature and evolutionary processes do just the opposite. In nutrition, we determine the needs and formulate diets for the, quote, average member of a herd, not for individuals. But variation among individuals affects productivity of the group if the diet diverges as much from what individuals at the extremes of these curves, which is often as much as half of the individuals, prefer and can tolerate. Differences among individuals in food intake and preference depend in part on variations in how animals are built and how they function, built morphologically and how they function physiologically. And marked differences are common even among uniform animals in regard to needs for nutrients and ability to cope with secondary compounds. Providing a variety of foods creates options, even for animals that are, quote, similar morphologically and physiologically, to eat different combinations of foods that yield benefits that are necessary for the individual. Individuals can better meet needs for nutrients and regulate intake of secondary compounds when offered a variety of foods, as I've mentioned, whether that's in confinement, on pastures or on rangelands, than when they're confined to a single species diet, even if that diet is, quote, nutritionally balanced. Variety thus enables individuality, but what are the origins of individuality? Why is every individual unique, as was talked about many times yesterday? Since the dawn of the age of genetics, people have been taught that genes are destiny. News broadcasts that regularly announce the discovery of a new gene for everything you can imagine reinforce this one-dimensional notion of genetic determinism. And most modern textbooks still fail to stress the all-encompassing influence of biophysical environment and especially social environments on development. This bias dates back to Darwin, who wrote, quote, seedlings from the same fruit and young of the same litter sometimes differ considerably from each other, though both the young and the parents have been exposed to exactly the same conditions of life. This shows how unimportant the direct effects of the conditions of life are in comparison with the laws of reproduction and growth and of inheritance. Near the end of his life, end quote. Near the end of his life, however, Darwin conceded that environment was not considered sufficiently in evolution. In a letter to Moritz Wagner in 1888, he wrote the following, quote, in my opinion, the greatest error which I have committed has been not allowing sufficient weight to the direct action of the environment, end quote. Even now, well over 100 years later, we're just beginning to appreciate that ongoing adaptation involves a continuous dialogue among genes and ever-changing social and biophysical environments. The ever-changing nature of nature requires genes converse with the environment, and this important conversation begins during development in utero and early in life. It continues throughout life, and it moves across generations. These interactions have lifelong influences on diet, obesity, health, and disease in humans, and they influence the food and habitat selection behaviors of herbivores. By interacting with the genome during growth and development, social and biophysical environments influence gene expression, behavioral responses. One of the most fascinating stories I like to tell nowadays is about the bed hedging strategies of E. coli. There's a book just out titled Microcosm, E. coli and the New Science of Life by Carl Zimmer. In the book, Zimmer describes how E. coli express their individuality. Even E. coli that are absolutely identical genetically express entirely different physiologies and behaviors, from physical stamina to ability to digest lactose, to persistence, to hairy coats, to selfless suicide and susceptibility to viruses. All these are being epigenetically orchestrated as these genes talk with the ever-changing environments. And chance plays a critical role. That's the point. A colony of E. coli thus uses noise to hedge its bets, and it does so at virtually no cost if you simply allow chance to cause these things to happen. The ensuing tremendous variation is why we can never get rid of these guys, even with any kind of antibiotics we throw at them. They're all so different. More generally, to be resilient at the level of the population, counter dynamism and variability with variability. Make lots of them and make them all different. At the level of the individual, counter variability with adaptability. Give them the ability to learn. And even E. coli do that. The general point I'm making is simply that everything becomes inflected uniquely in time and space, a result of this ongoing dialogue among genes and ever-changing biophysical environments. And it's everything from E. coli to humans, and the plant world is responding the same way. All behaviors are thus a function of history, necessity, and chance, mediated by an ongoing dialogue between nature and nurture. And as I'm saying, the emerging field of epigenetics is highlighting this dynamism as no field has ever done before. All of this has to do then with what it means for domestic and wild animals as well as humans to be locally adapted to the landscapes we inhabit. Given this dynamism then that I'm trying to portray, in both social and biophysical environments as well as in individuals, it should come as no surprise that Dave Brisky and colleagues in REM conclude the following, quote, "The absence of consistent management and policy recommendations concerning the adoption of grazing systems after several decades of experimental research and commercial application is a testament to the complexity of the task. The complexity resides in a broad array of confounding variables that make a direct, valid comparison between grazing systems and continuous grazing all but impossible. Consider the wide range of ecological variation associated with rainfall regime, amount, seasonality, intra and inter-annual variability, vegetation structure, composition, productivity, prior land use, livestock characteristics, breeds, prior conditioning, care, handling. This tremendous ecological variability is paralleled by variability associated with the commitment, ability, goals, and opportunities of managers operating this system. Managerial variability poses a unique problem," they go on, "because unlike ecological variability, it is seldom recognized and documented, which makes it especially difficult to disentangle from the ecological component of the grazing system," end quote. No doubt about it. These are self-organizing systems that display three characteristics. One, their behaviors emerge from the virtually infinite number of interactions that occur as parts of the system interrelate one with another through time and space. Thus, modifications we make to a system typically produce results no one can predict in advance. Two, they demonstrate sensitivity to initial conditions. You can get one result one day, but the identical interaction the next day may yield a different result. So we cannot know with certainty how the system will respond. Three, finally, when we interact with a complex system, we provoke downstream consequences that emerge days, weeks, even years later. Life, thus, is an unending series of unanticipated and unintended consequences. We don't understand complex systems, except in a general way. We simply interact with them and adapt as they're adapting too. Whenever we think we understand them, we learn that we don't. I'm going to conclude with some thoughts on the relationship between movement and uniqueness with regard to science and management. What we call time is in fact change, and what we call space is in fact relationships. What people of all disciplines thus study is the ever-changing nature of nature, and as everything is a consequence of everything else, quote, explaining nature simply means showing its dynamism and unity. Everything is connected and in movement, and ultimately there's really nothing to explain. Science is an attempt to understand the ever-changing nature of nature, but there is no absolute truth in science. All concepts and theories are limited and approximate. Science is a quest for understanding, for truth, an attempt to account for observable phenomena. But science cannot be perceived as true or final in any absolute sense. It's merely a tentative organization of working hypotheses that, for the moment, best account for facts concerning biophysical processes whose interconnections are the fabric of a web characterized by change. Quantum and relativistic physics, as well as mystical thought, consider change and transformation as the primary aspects of nature. And they see the structures and the symmetries generated by change as secondary. Physicists have come to realize that the structures and phenomena we observe in nature are nothing but the creations of our measuring and categorizing minds. Eastern mystics tell us again and again that all things and events we perceive are creations of the mind, arising from particular states of consciousness and dissolving again as that state is transcended. In atomic physics, we can never speak about nature without at the same time including ourselves. Nature doesn't show us any, quote, isolated basic building blocks, but rather appears as a complicated web of relations among various parts of the whole. And most importantly, that always includes the human observer. Nothing is more important about the quantum principle than this, wrote John Archibald Wheeler, that it destroys the concept of the world as, quote, sitting out there, with the observer safely separated from it by a 20 centimeter slab of plate glass. Even to observe so minuscule an object as an electron, he must shatter the glass. He must break in, must install his chosen measuring equipment. Moreover, the measurement changes the state of the electron. The universe will never afterwards be the same. To describe what has happened, one has to cross out the old word observer and put in its place the new word participator. In some strange sense, this universe is a participatory universe. The new physics cogently explains, as Meg Wheatley wrote in Leadership in the New Science then, that there is no objective reality out there waiting to reveal its secrets. There are no recipes or formula, no checklists or advice that describes reality. There's only what we create through our engagement with others and with events. Nothing really transfers. Everything's always new and different and unique to each of us. In this realm, there's a new kind of freedom, where it's more rewarding to explore than to reach conclusions, more satisfying to wonder than to know, and more exciting to search than to stay put. End quote. Science and management, then, are both creative activities. In the case of herbivory, as with any discipline, they're distinct but complementary. They can be very complementary endeavors. The art in science is elucidating principles that underlie the processes of nature, including for herbivory, the behavior of soils, plants, herbivores, and people. Principles are manifest everywhere at all times. They transcend time and space. In the case of behavior, for instance, all creatures from soil microbes to humans behave as a function of the consequences to them. Happens everywhere, and it always has. The challenge for scientists intent on identifying principles is to clearly discriminate the elementary idea that transcends time and space from their local inflections manifest differently everywhere throughout time. This is a critical distinction that often isn't made. This important distinction then separates the subject matter into two quite different categories. The former, science, more readily lends itself to analyses involving replicated study and control of variables, while the latter does not, as it's utterly context dependent. For example, while behavior depends upon consequences, the scientific principle, the origins and manifestations of behaviors are wholly dependent on the social and biophysical context in which individuals are conceived, born, and then live, the local cultural inflection in space and time. We had an excellent example, many yesterday, I'll give you just one, when David was talking about the nitrogen cycle. Scientists have come to understand how the nitrogen cycle works, but how the nitrogen cycle